Saturday morning in suburban Los Angeles began as it should, with soft light filtering through the curtains, the hum of a lawn mower around the corner, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee as Emily Kelly carefully poured it into ceramic mugs. Their house on Oak Street, a two-story building with a white picket fence and slightly faded blue paint, looked like hundreds of others in the neighborhood. The neat lawn, the bed of roses that Emily watered more out of habit than any love of gardening, and the child's bike carelessly abandoned on the porch painted the picture of a typical American family. Today, there was to be a barbecue, one of those events that in the suburbs serves as both a ritual and a way to remind your neighbors that you are still a part of their small, cozy world. Emily stood at the kitchen island, slicing tomatoes for a salad. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, the knife flashing through her hands, leaving neat red slices on the wooden board. She had put on her favorite dress, a light blue with tiny flowers, and her hair was neatly done to look like she had everything in her life under control. But if you looked closely, you could see her gaze flickering to her phone, resting on the edge of the counter. The screen lit up every few minutes, and each time Emily would take a quick, almost imperceptible look at the notifications before returning to her tomatoes. "Sophie, Mike, don't forget to get the toys off the lawn," she called toward the backyard, where her children, Sophie, 12, and Mike, 8, were chasing each other with water pistols. Their laughter echoed across the yard, mixing with the distant barking of a neighbor's dog. Emily smiled, but it was strained, as if she were trying to live up to a role she'd been playing for years. Thomas Kelly, her husband, appeared in the kitchen, a case of beer in his hands. He was wearing jeans and a plaid shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His face, slightly tanned from a rare weekend at the beach, looked tired, but he tried to act cheerful. At 38, he was still attractive, tall, with dark hair that was just beginning to gray. But there were shadows under his eyes, the result of long nights spent working on his laptop, finalizing designs for his company's new project. The technology firm in Santa Monica, where he worked as an engineer, demanded everything from him, and Thomas, a man who believed in honest work and stability, did not know how to say no. "How many people are coming today?" he asked, setting the box on the table and opening the refrigerator to put away the beer. His voice was calm, but there was a slight distraction in it, as if some of his thoughts were still in the office. "About 15 people, I guess," Emily answered, not looking up from her cutting. The Browns, Laura and her husband, a couple of neighbors. Jake promised to drop by if he wasn't busy. "Jake's always busy," Thomas chuckled, closing the refrigerator door. "But he'll find time if there's steak." Emily nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She remembered how last week, Jake, an old friend of theirs, had walked into her favorite coffee shop where she was sitting on her laptop, working on another article for a local magazine. He had joked around as usual, but his gaze had lingered a little too long when she had mentioned that she was writing about finding inspiration. She had quickly changed the subject, but now, standing in the kitchen, she wondered if he had noticed something. Jake, a divorce lawyer, was too perceptive not to notice the change in her tone. Thomas, meanwhile, went outside to fire up the grill. He loved Saturdays like this, loud, full of laughter, and the smell of grilling meat. It reminded him of when he was a kid, when his dad would throw similar barbecues at their old house in Oregon. He looked at Sophie, who was trying to talk Mike into giving her the water gun, and smiled. His kids were his pride, even if he didn't always have time to show it. The work was taking up too much of his energy, but he promised himself that things would get better soon. The project would be finished, and he would be able to spend more time at home. "Dad, are you going to grill the sausages on the coals again?" Sophie shouted, running up to him with wet hair and a sly smile. "Hey, that was one time and you still ate them." Thomas pretended to be offended, patting her on the head. Sophie laughed and ran back to her brother. Emily watched the scene through the kitchen window. Her heart ached with a warm, familiar feeling love for her family, for this house, for the life they had built. But then, like a shadow, came another feeling, the emptiness that had settled inside her over the past few years. She loved Thomas, but his constant absence, his absorption in his work, made her invisible. Her writing, her thoughts, her dreams of something more than suburban routine went unnoticed. She remembered rereading old stories she had written in college the other day, and how painful it had been to realize that Emily, full of ambition, had disappeared. The phone on the table lit up again. Emily glanced quickly at it, a text from Matthew. "Read that book you were talking about. Let's talk over coffee next week." She felt her cheeks flush slightly and quickly turned to the sink to rinse her knife. She didn't answer, but the thought of meeting Matthew, of his attentive eyes and easy smile, made her heart beat faster. "Emily, where are you?" Thomas's voice brought her back to reality. He was standing in the doorway, holding a bag of charcoal. "Will you help me with the steak sauce? You know I always oversalt it." "Of course," she said, drying her hands on a towel. She came up to him, trying to smile so that he wouldn't notice her confusion. Thomas looked at her with his usual warmth, but there was something else in his gaze, a slight weariness, as if he, too, sensed that their life, for all its outward gloss, was beginning to fall apart. The barbecue began around noon. Neighbors filled the yard, bringing plastic plates of homemade salads and bottles of wine. Emily's friend Laura Mendez showed up with a tray of homemade empanadas, which were an instant hit. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her smile was as warm as ever. But Emily noticed Laura give her a brief, searching glance as she helped set out the plates. "Are you okay?" Laura asked quietly when they were alone at the drinks table. "You seem thoughtful." "Just tired," Emily said with a shrug. "Articles, kids, all that fuss." Laura nodded, but her eyes lingered on Emily a little longer than usual. She knew her friend too well to believe that explanation, but she decided not to press the issue. Instead, she switched the conversation to the new menu at her cafe, and Emily was relieved to pick up the thread. Thomas, meanwhile, stood at the grill, flipping steaks and chatting with his neighbor, Mr. Brown, about property prices. His thoughts kept returning to his work. The deadline for the project was approaching, and he knew he would have another sleepless night on Monday. But he tried to be there, in the moment, laughing at his neighbor's jokes, winking at Sophie when she stole a piece of bread from the table. This was his life, and he was grateful for it, even if sometimes he felt like something was missing. As the sun began to set, the courtyard filled with a soft orange light. Children played tag, adults sat at tables, sipping wine and discussing local gossip. Emily sat next to Thomas, her hand on his knee, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the book she had discussed with Matthew, how he had listened to her without interrupting, as if her words actually mattered. She glanced at Thomas, who was laughing at yet another of Mr. Brown's stories, and felt a pang of guilt. He was a good man, a good father, but it wasn't enough. As the guests began to leave, Emily and Thomas cleared the dishes. They worked silently, harmoniously, like a couple who had known each other for years. But the silence between them was not comfortable. It was heavy, full of unsaid things. Emily wanted to say something, to ask how his day had been, but instead she simply put the plates in the dishwasher and went upstairs, citing fatigue. Thomas stayed downstairs, looking out at the empty yard. He thought about how much he loved his family and how rarely he told them. Maybe tomorrow he will take Sophie and Mike to the beach, spend the day with them. Maybe that would help. He didn't know that at that very moment Emily, sitting on the edge of her bed, opened a text from Matthew and began typing a reply. It was a quiet, almost lazy, Wednesday evening in suburban Los Angeles, with a gentle breeze rustling the palm trees along the street. The local library on the corner of Main Street, a low building with large windows and a weathered brick facade, glowed with a warm light, inviting those seeking refuge from the monotony of suburban life. The interior smelled of old books and the freshly brewed tea that Mrs. Henderson, the librarian, always put out for book club members. Emily Kelly walked in, clutching a tattered copy of Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Her steps were confident, but there was a hint of hesitation in her eyes, as if she were unsure whether she should come here at all. Emily loved these evenings. The book club, which met once a month, was her little oasis, a place where she could stop being just a wife and mother for a while. Here she felt like the girl again who, in college, dreamed of writing novels, traveling the world, and arguing about literature until midnight. But lately, even these gatherings have begun to feel routine. The same faces, the same discussions, the same jokes from Mrs. Henderson about how they read books these days, not scrolled through their phones. Emily increasingly found herself wanting something new, something that would shake up her life, like the wind that suddenly swoops in and tears dry leaves from the trees. She sat down at a long wooden table, around which a few familiar faces had already gathered. An older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, who always argued about symbolism, a young mother, Kate, who came over for a break from diapers, and a few other neighbors whose names Emily sometimes forgot. Today, however, there was a newcomer in the room. He sat at the far end of the table, casually leafing through a book. Matthew, that was how he had introduced himself when Mrs. Henderson had asked him to introduce himself. He was tall, with dark hair that was slightly tousled, and wore a dark green shirt that looked as if he had chosen it at random. His eyes, alert and calm, caught Emily's attention immediately. He spoke with a slight accent that betrayed that he was not from around here, and he mentioned that he traveled the country photographing the real America, the people, the places, the moments that usually go unnoticed. "I'm just passing through," he said, smiling at the corner of his mouth. But I couldn't miss the discussion of Fitzgerald. Gatsby is like a mirror in which everyone sees something of their own. Emily nodded, not looking away. It wasn't so much what he said that interested her, but the way he said it easy confidence, but not arrogance. The discussion began, and the conversation quickly turned to Gatsby, his dream, and his inevitable downfall. Mr. Wilson, as usual, insisted that the whole story was a critique of capitalism, and Kate timidly suggested that Gatsby simply loved the wrong woman. Emily was silent, listening as always, but her thoughts kept returning to Matthew. He didn't speak often, but every word he said was precise, as if he had thought through what he wanted to say in advance. When he mentioned that he saw Gatsby as a man who had tried to fill an emptiness inside himself with an illusion, Emily felt her heart clench slightly. She knew that emptiness. "What do you think, Emily?" Mrs. Henderson asked suddenly, breaking her out of her reverie. All eyes turned to her, and she felt her cheeks flush slightly. I, I think Gatsby was lonely," she began, trying to speak calmly. He surrounded himself with people, parties, and wealth, but it was all to forget that he didn't know who he really was. And Daisy, she wasn't the answer, just another dream that couldn't come true. Matthew looked at her with interest, tilting his head slightly. "That's true," he said. "Sometimes we want something so much that we stop seeing what it's worth. But you know, I think Gatsby was right to try anyway. It's better to be shattered by a dream than not to have dreamed at all." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth spreading in her chest. She wasn't used to someone listening so attentively to her words without interrupting or turning the conversation to themselves. Thomas, for all his love, often ignored her thoughts, immersed in his projects. But here, in this stuffy room, amid the smell of old books and the hum of voices, she suddenly felt seen. The discussion continued, but Emily was no longer paying close attention to the argument about the green light on Gatsby's dock. She was watching Matthew, who was taking notes on a small pad, smiling occasionally at someone's remark. When Mrs. Henderson called a break, he came to the table with tea and biscuits, and Emily, almost unconsciously, found herself there. "That's a good idea about Gatsby's loneliness," he said, pouring himself some tea. "You probably read a lot?" "I used to read more," Emily answered, taking a plastic cup of water. "I even tried to write myself before. Stories, essays. But now it's more of a hobby. Life, you know, is addictive." "I know," Matthew nodded, and there was a hint of something personal in his voice. "I'm also an epidote the photo project you were talking about." He showed her some of his photos on his phone, people's faces at fairs, in small cafes, at abandoned gas stations. "This is my attempt to capture what makes us real. Not staged shots, but life as it is." Emily looked at the photographs and was struck by how he could find beauty in simple things. In the smile of an old lady selling lemonade, in the tired hands of a farmer, in children running in the rain. She felt her own dreams, long buried under the weight of routine, begin to stir somewhere deep inside. "It's amazing," she said earnestly. "It's like you see people as they are, without masks." "I try," Matthew smiled. "But you know, it's not just about them. It's about me too. I'm looking for something real. Sometimes I think I take pictures to understand what I myself am missing." Emily paused, unsure of what to say. His words had touched something inside her, some old wound she had tried to ignore. She wanted to ask him what he meant, but instead she simply nodded and changed the subject, asking about his travels. Matthew told her stories of small towns in Idaho, of people who shared their stories with him, and how he was tired of being on the road but couldn't stop. Their conversation flowed easily, as if they had known each other for years rather than minutes. Emily found herself smiling more than usual, her voice growing more lively as she talked about the books she had loved in her youth. As the evening drew to a close, Matthew lingered at the door while Emily gathered her things. "You know, I'd like to continue this conversation," he said, looking into her eyes. "Maybe over coffee sometime. I'm working on a book about my photography, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. You've written, so you know your stories." Emily felt her heart skip a beat. She knew she should say no. She had a family, children, a husband who was probably sitting in his office, finishing a report. But there was something in his gaze that made her stop. Not just interest, but sincerity, as if he really wanted to hear her. She thought of Thomas, his tired eyes, the way he asked her less and less about her day, and almost against her will, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Give me your number, I'll write." Matthew smiled, wrote his number down on a piece of paper, and handed it to her. "I'll be waiting," he said, and there was no hint of pressure in his voice, just a hint of hope. Emily walked out of the library, clutching the paper in her hand. The street was dark, the streetlights casting soft circles of light on the sidewalk. She felt as if she had just stepped into an abyss. There was nothing wrong with meeting for coffee, she told herself. It was just a conversation, just a chance to feel alive again. But somewhere deep down, she knew that this evening had changed something inside her, and that little piece of paper in her hand felt heavier than it felt. The Morning Brew on the corner of Main Street was the heart of a small Los Angeles suburb, a place where locals started their days with coffee and fresh pastries and lingered in the evenings as the sun set and chatted. The walls were painted a warm cream color and hung with local paintings, while the wooden tables, slightly worn with age, created an atmosphere of comfort and simplicity. Laura Mendez, the owner, stood behind the counter, wiping down the coffee machine with a soft cloth. Her movements were practiced, almost automatic, but her gaze kept wandering around the room, where a few customers were sipping drinks. It was a busy Friday morning. School moms were discussing soccer practice schedules, a couple of students were working on their laptops, and an elderly Mr. Clark, a regular, was leafing through the newspaper, as he did every morning. Laura, 34, with dark hair pulled back into a low bun and warm brown eyes, was the life of the place. She knew the names of almost all the regulars who liked their lattes with almond milk and who always asked for a double espresso without sugar. But today, her thoughts were far from the orders and the smiles. Her own life seemed to be falling apart. Her husband, Raul, was working late more and more often, and their conversations, once full of laughter, were now limited to short sentences about bills and household chores. Laura tried not to think about it, but the emptiness in her chest was growing, and the cafe, her pride and joy, no longer brought the comfort it once did. Emily Kelly sat in the far corner of the room by the window. She had arrived about half an hour ago, ordering a cappuccino and a croissant that she had barely touched. Across from her sat a man Laura didn't recognize, tall, with dark hair and a slight smile that seemed both sincere and cautious. They sat closer than casual acquaintances were supposed to, and Laura noticed Emily leaning a little closer to him when he spoke. Their conversation was quiet but animated, and Emily laughed occasionally, not loudly, but in the way people laugh when they're trying to hide their excitement. Laura couldn't hear what they were saying, but something about their postures, the way their hands were almost touching the table, made her wary. Emily looked different today. Her blue dress had been replaced with jeans and a soft white sweater that made her look younger, almost carefree. She had pulled her hair back into a loose ponytail, and there was a hint of color in her cheeks that Laura hadn't seen in a long time. Emily had always been charismatic, with her quick wit and ability to hold her own in any conversation, but in recent years she had seemed increasingly distant, as if a part of her had been left behind. Today, she was alive, almost radiant, and it made Laura feel a twinge of unease. Laura turned back to the coffee machine, trying to concentrate on her work. She didn't want to peek, didn't want to intrude. Emily had been her friend for almost a decade. They'd met when Sophie and Laura's son, Carlos, went to the same preschool. They'd shared everything from recipes to their fears about raising children in a world that was changing too quickly. But in recent months, Emily had been coming into the cafe less often, calling less often. Laura had chalked it up to her being busy articles, children, home. But now, watching her with this stranger, she began to suspect something else was going on. The cafe door rang, and Jake Wilson walked in. Tall, with a touch of gray at the temples and a navy suit jacket that he wore with a slightly unbuttoned shirt, he looked like a man who knew how to make an impression. Jake was a divorce lawyer, and his work had made him a cynical observer of human foibles. He could read people, their gestures, their intonations, the unspoken words, and it served him well in the courtroom, but it poisoned his personal life. His own marriage had ended 3 years earlier when he discovered that his wife was cheating on him with a coworker. Since then, he had avoided serious relationships, preferring casual acquaintances and long evenings at the bar with friends. "Morning espresso, Laura," he said, walking up to the counter and giving her his signature smile. "And please, without that vanilla syrup you tried to poison me with last time." Laura rolled her eyes, but smiled back. "You just don't understand good taste, Wilson. Just a minute." As she made coffee, Jake glanced around the room. His eyes landed on Emily and her companion. He frowned, recognizing the man across from her. Matthew Crow, a photographer he'd met a few months earlier when he'd consulted with him about a publishing deal. Jake didn't know him well, but he knew that Matthew was charming, quick to strike up conversations, and had a reputation for not staying in one place for long. Seeing him with Emily gave Jake a twinge in his chest. He'd known Emily and Thomas for over 15 years. They'd been friends since college. Thomas had been like a brother to him, the man who'd always been there for him even when his own life was falling apart. And now, as Jake watched Emily laugh at something Matthew had said, he realized he was looking at a story he'd seen dozens of times in his work. He turned away, accepting the coffee from Laura's hand. "Who's with Emily?" he asked casually, trying to sound indifferent. Laura glanced toward the corner table. "I don't know," she said, lowering her voice. "She came in with it about 20 minutes ago. Said it was for work, something about taking photos for her article. But—" She hesitated, unsure whether to continue. "But what?" Jake raised an eyebrow, sipping his coffee. Laura shrugged, drying her hands on a towel. "They don't look like colleagues. They're too close." Jake nodded, his eyes never leaving Emily. He saw her lean toward Matthew, her hand brushing the edge of the table, almost brushing his fingers. He knew that body language. He'd seen it in his clients, in their stories of broken marriages. But this was Emily, his best friend's wife. He remembered Thomas telling him about how tired he was, how he struggled to keep everything under control: his job, his family, his mortgage. Jake knew Thomas wasn't perfect, that he was too wrapped up in his projects, but he also knew that Thomas loved Emily more than anything in the world. "Maybe it's nothing," he said, more to himself than to Laura. "People meet, talk. There's no point in drawing conclusions." Laura looked at him doubtfully. "Maybe so. But I know Emily. She's not like usual. She's happy, but like she's afraid of it." Jake didn't answer. He finished his coffee, left a few dollars on the counter, and headed for the door. But before he left, he glanced at Emily one more time. She hadn't noticed him, lost in her conversation. Matthew was showing her something on his phone, and she was smiling in a way Jake hadn't seen in a long time. He felt his stomach clench. He knew he should do something, call Thomas, talk to Emily, at least drop a hint. But instead, he walked out of the cafe, deciding it wasn't his business. He'd seen too many families torn apart by secrets like this, and he didn't want to be the one to put a match to their lives. Emily felt like she was back in her 20s. Matthew was telling her about his last trip to New Orleans, about the jazz clubs and people he'd met. His voice was calm but full of life, and she found herself holding her breath. He wasn't like the men in her life, not like Thomas, who was always busy, not like the neighbors, whose conversations revolved around sports and the price of gas. Matthew talked about what he'd seen, what he'd felt, and asked for her opinion as if it really mattered. "Have you ever thought about just leaving?" he asked, sipping his coffee. "You know, leaving everything and going somewhere where no one knows you?" Emily laughed, but it sounded nervous. "I have kids, Matthew, and a house, and," she trailed off, unsure how to finish. "It's not that simple." "I know," he nodded, "but sometimes I think we cage ourselves. Work, family, expectations. And then we look back and realize we've forgotten who we really are." His words stung, as if he were voicing something she was afraid to admit. She remembered the stories she'd written in college, her dreams of travel, of a life of meaning. Now her days were filled with school assemblies and laundry and articles no one read. She looked at Matthew, and for a moment she wanted to tell him everything about her longing, about feeling like she was melting into routine. But instead she smiled and said, "Maybe you're right, but I'm not as brave as you." "I'm not brave," he said, leaning closer. "I'm just running from myself. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't." Emily felt her cheeks heat up. She looked away, pretending to look out the window. She knew she should leave, that this conversation was going too far, but she didn't want to interrupt him. For the first time in a long time, she felt alive. Laura stood behind the counter, watching them. She saw Emily laugh, the sparkle in her eyes, and it gave her mixed feelings. She wanted to be happy for her friend, but at the same time she felt like it was wrong. Emily was married, she had a family. Laura knew what it was like to feel lonely in a marriage. She herself sometimes looked at Raoul and didn't recognize the man she was marrying. But cheating, that was too much. She wanted to talk to Emily, to ask what was going on, but she was afraid. What if she was wrong? What if this ruined their friendship? Laura sighed as she cleared away the coffee cups and decided to keep quiet for now. But deep down, she knew that this secret would haunt her. When Emily and Matthew finally stood up to leave, Laura came over to their table to clear the dishes. "Everything okay?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Yeah, I'm fine," Emily replied, but her gaze was evasive. "This is Matthew. He's helping me with article ideas." Matthew smiled and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you. You have a great cafe." Laura shook his hand, but her smile was strained. "Thank you. Come again." After they left, Laura stood by the window, watching Emily and Matthew walk down the street. She felt her heart tighten. She wanted to believe Emily, wanted to think that this really was just a job. But she knew it wasn't, and now she had to decide what to do with that truth. Tuesday night fell on Oak Street with the soft quiet of a weekday suburb of Los Angeles. Warm lamps burned in the Kelly house, casting cozy shadows on the living room walls, which still smelled of the spaghetti and sauce Emily had cooked for the kids. Thomas Kelly sat on the couch, holding a mug of cold tea, watching the television, which played an old sitcom with the volume turned down. His attention was scattered, his mind wandering between work and home, between deadlines and the promises he'd made to himself. To spend more time with his family, to be more attentive to Sophie and Mike, to notice the world around him. But tonight, his thoughts kept returning to Emily. She was sitting at the kitchen table, bent over her laptop, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The light from the screen reflected in her eyes, and Thomas noticed how she occasionally glanced at her phone next to her. It wasn't new Emily was always glued to her phone, checking email, responding to messages from the magazine editor or parents at school. But in recent weeks, the habit has become more noticeable. She grabbed the phone with a kind of haste, as if she were afraid she'd missed something important, and every time the screen lit up, her face changed a small smile, almost imperceptible, but one that Thomas hadn't seen when they spoke. "Work again?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. He turned to face her, setting his mug on the coffee table. "You seem to be on call 24/7 today." Emily looked up from her laptop, and for a second he thought she looked wary, but she smiled quickly, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Yeah, the story," she said with a shrug. "The editor wanted a draft by Friday, so I'm trying to keep up." Thomas nodded, but her answer didn't reassure him. Something in her tone, the way she quickly looked away, made him feel a small twinge of worry. He tried to push it away, reminding himself that he and Emily were fine. They'd been together for almost 15 years, through kids, a mortgage, his long hours at work. Sure, they'd had tough times, but they'd always gotten through it. And yet, looking at her now, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was an invisible wall between them. "Maybe you should take a break," he suggested, standing up and walking over to the kitchen table. "We can watch something together. Sophie and Mike are already asleep. We can have an evening for two." Emily looked at him with a small smile, but there was something in her eyes he couldn't quite place. "That sounds good," she said, "but I really need to finish this. Maybe tomorrow." Thomas nodded, feeling his enthusiasm fading. "Sure," he said, walking back to the couch. He turned up the volume on the TV, but his mind was elsewhere. He remembered how Emily had gone out on business on Saturday morning last week, saying she was meeting a friend. She had returned a few hours later, and everything had been as usual, but Thomas had noticed that she had been unusually quiet, almost thoughtful. At the time, he had chalked it up to fatigue, but now, looking at her, he began to wonder. As Emily stood up to pour herself a water, her phone, left on the table, lit up. Thomas glanced at the screen without thinking. The notification was short, but the sender's name made him freeze. Matthew. The message read, "You were right about that book. I want to hear more of your thoughts." Thomas felt his heart clench. He didn't know any Matthew. A coworker, a friend, someone from her book club. He wanted to ask, but something stopped him, maybe the fear that the answer wouldn't be what he wanted to hear. Emily walked back to the table, picked up her phone, and when she saw the notification, she quickly put it back in her pocket. She looked at Thomas, and their eyes met for a moment. "What?" she asked, noticing his tense expression. "Nothing," he replied, trying to smile. "I was just thinking." She nodded and turned back to her laptop, but Thomas felt his thoughts starting to swirl in dangerous directions. He tried to focus on the TV, but the image of the name Matthew on her phone kept nagging at him. Who was he? Why hadn't she mentioned him before? And why did she smile when she read his message being so alive? Later, when Emily went upstairs to check on the kids, Thomas remained in the living room. Her laptop was still open, the screen glowing a soft blue. He knew he shouldn't, that it was an invasion of her privacy, but curiosity or maybe fear got the better of him. He walked over to the desk and sat in her place, staring at the screen. Her browser was open to a word processor page, where she was working on an article about local artists. The writing was good. As always, Emily had a way of writing that made her articles read easily but with depth. But Thomas didn't read it. Instead, he opened a folder on his desktop labeled Working Files. Inside were a few documents, a couple of article drafts, and a folder labeled Photos for Article. He clicked on it, expecting to see pictures of paintings or local landscapes. Instead, the screen filled with photos that clearly had nothing to do with her work. One was of Emily standing on a beach, the wind blowing through her hair, her eyes glittering in the sun. She looked happy, almost carefree, and Thomas felt his throat tighten. He hadn't seen her like this in a long time. Another was of her sitting in a cafe, not Morning Brew, but some other place with wooden tables and windows overlooking a busy street. She was holding a cup of coffee, and her smile was directed at someone out of frame. Thomas flipped through a few more pictures. They were beautiful, professional, with soft lighting and attention to detail. In one of the pictures, Emily was standing outside a bookstore, holding an old edition, her eyes filled with some kind of quiet delight. At the bottom of each picture was the caption, "Copyright Matthew Crow." Thomas felt the blood pound in his temples. He closed the folder, trying to breathe evenly, but his hands were shaking slightly. He returned to the couch, trying to collect his thoughts. These could just be photos for her article, right? She had mentioned working with a photographer. But then why hadn't she told him about it? Why were these pictures so personal? And why did she look at them like he hadn't seen her in years? Emily came downstairs, holding an empty laundry basket. "The kids are asleep," she said, setting the basket down by the stairs. "I think I'll go to bed too. I'm tired." "Yeah," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice even. "I'll just sit here for a little while longer." She nodded and went upstairs, and he sat there, staring into space. His thoughts were swarming like flies around a lamp, and he couldn't stop them. He remembered how Emily had gone out a few days ago to meet a friend and returned with a hint of perfume he hadn't noticed before. He remembered how she'd started locking her phone with a password more often, which she hadn't done before. And now these photos, this Matthew, these messages. Thomas stood up and paced the living room, trying to calm himself. He told himself it was probably nothing. Emily wasn't like that. She loved him. She loved the kids. But the doubt, once it had begun, wouldn't go away. He thought about asking her directly, but something stopped him. Fear? Pride? He didn't know. Instead, he decided he'd pay attention. He'd start noticing little things: her schedule, her mood, her phone number. He didn't want to be the husband who spied on his wife, but he also didn't want to be the one who was left in the dark. When he finally got into bed, Emily was already asleep, her back to him. Her breathing was even, but Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how everything had changed. Their marriage, which had once seemed so solid, now felt like a house with cracks in its foundation still standing, but ready to crumble at the slightest push. The Rusty Anchor, a bar on the outskirts of Los Angeles, was a place where time seemed to have stopped somewhere in the 90s. The worn wooden tables, dim neon lights, and the smell of fried wings created an atmosphere where you could forget about the outside world. On this Friday night, the place was half full. A few regulars were discussing baseball at the bar, a couple of young guys were shooting pool, and Bruce Springsteen was blaring from an old jukebox. Jake Wilson sat at a corner table, sipping a dark beer from a frosted bottle. His navy suit jacket was slung over the back of his chair, and his shirt was unbuttoned to the top button, a sign that the work week was over for him. Across from him sat Thomas Kelly, his best friend, whose face looked tired, as if he hadn't slept for several nights. Thomas twirled his glass of whiskey in his hands, looking at the liquid as if it could answer questions he didn't dare voice. Jake had known Thomas since college, almost 20 years of friendship filled with shared memories. Parties, first jobs, Thomas and Emily's wedding, the births of their children. Jake was Sophie's godfather, and he had always considered the Kelly family something of an anchor in his own, far less stable life. His own marriage had fallen apart 3 years earlier when he discovered that his wife, Carol, had been cheating on him with a coworker. The pain of that betrayal still rankled inside him, like an old scar that aches before it rains. Now, as he sat across from Thomas, he could feel that scar pulsing. He'd seen Emily with Matthew at Laura's 2 days earlier, and the image wouldn't leave his mind. Their closeness, her laughter, the way she leaned toward him, it was all too familiar. He'd seen scenes like this dozens of times in his work as a divorce lawyer, and each time they ended the same way, in pain, blame, and broken families. Thomas took a sip of whiskey and set the glass down on the table with a soft thud. "I don't know what's going on, Jake," he said, looking off to the side. "Emily, she's different. Always on her phone, going off somewhere, saying it's for work, but I don't know. Something's wrong." Jake felt his throat tighten. He knew the truth, knew the name behind the business. Matthew Crow, the photographer whose face he couldn't forget after that meeting in the coffee shop. He wanted to tell Thomas everything now, lay his cards on the table, but the words stuck. Instead, he took a sip of beer and shrugged. Maybe it's just stress. You both have a lot going on. Kids, work, everything. Thomas shook his head, his fingers nervously tapping the rim of his glass. No, it's not just stress. She's distant. She used to always tell me about her articles, about the things that were bothering her. Now there's silence. I ask her how her day was, and she says something like, fine, and goes into another room. Jake looked at his friend, feeling the tension building inside him. He knew he should say something, give advice, but his own experience screamed at him to remain silent. When he found out about Carol, the truth had brought him no relief, only pain that had lasted for months. He didn't want Thomas to go through the same thing. But at the same time, he couldn't just sit by and watch his friend walk blindly toward the edge of the abyss. Maybe you're overthinking it, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. Marriage isn't always easy. Sometimes people just grow apart for a while. Thomas looked at him, a mixture of hope and doubt in his eyes. You think so? I saw her phone. There was a message from someone named Matthew. She quickly put it away, but I didn't miss it. Who is it, Jake? She never mentioned anyone named Matthew. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. He set the bottle down, buying himself time. Matthew? He asked, pretending the name meant nothing to him. Maybe someone from her work. She writes for a magazine. There are all sorts of photographers and designers there. Thomas frowned, his fingers tightening around the glass. Maybe, but I found pictures on her laptop. I don't know how to explain it. She looks happy, Jake, like I haven't seen her in a long time. And all of them are signed by Matthew. Jake looked away, staring at the pool table in the corner where two guys were arguing over whose turn it was. He felt his resolve to remain silent begin to crack. He knew Matthew Crow not well, but well enough to know that he wasn't the type to stay in one place for long. He was charming, had a way of making people feel special, and that made him dangerous. Jake remembered Matthew coming into his office a few months ago to discuss a contract for his photo book. He'd seemed harmless then, just another creative type in his own world. But now, knowing that he was sitting in a cafe with Emily, Jake couldn't help but think that this was the man who could destroy his friend's family. Photographs aren't a reason to panic, he said finally, trying to sound confident. She writes about art, right? Maybe this is part of her project. Thomas looked at him, and there was something in his gaze that made Jake feel guilty. I want to believe that, Thomas said quietly, but I can't stop thinking about it. She leaves, doesn't say where. She smiles at her phone, but not at me. I feel like an idiot, Jake. Like I'm the last one to know what's going on in my own house. Jake pressed his lips together, fighting the urge to spill the beans. He thought back to his own marriage, the night he'd found the messages from her coworker on Carol's phone. He remembered how his world had crumbled in a matter of seconds, how he'd screamed and she'd cried, and how he'd spent months trying to figure out what he'd done wrong. He didn't want Thomas to go through that, but he also knew that the truth, once it came out, would haunt everyone. Listen, he said, leaning closer to Thomas. Maybe you should talk to her. Not accuse her, not interrogate her, just ask her how she is. Maybe she's just confused. It happens, you know. People get tired and start looking for something new. It doesn't mean all is lost. Thomas looked at him, his eyes full of tiredness and pain. What if she doesn't want to talk? What if I ask and she lies? Jake shrugged, feeling his own words ring hollow. Then you'll know more than you do now. But Tom, don't jump to conclusions. You know Emily. She's not the type to just ruin everything. Thomas nodded, but his face remained tense. I just want things to be like before, he said quietly. When we were happy, when I didn't feel like I was losing her. Jake looked at his friend, his heart clenching. He wanted to say, I saw her with someone else. I know who Matthew is. You're right, something's wrong. But instead, he took another sip of beer and changed the subject. Remember that time we went to Vegas after college, he said, forcing a smile. You lost all your money playing blackjack, and I tried to convince you it was an experience. Thomas smiled faintly, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Yes, it was, he said, looking into his glass. Things seem to have gotten more complicated since then. That's life, Jake said, trying to keep his voice light. But you can handle it. Just pay attention to her, okay? Maybe she's just waiting for you to notice. Thomas nodded, but Jake could see that his words did not bring his friend any relief. They sat for a while longer, discussing work, the children, the latest news, but the conversation was strained. Jake felt his conscience begin to weigh more and more heavily. He knew that his silence was a choice, and that it could cost Thomas dearly. But he also knew that the truth could destroy everything his friend had worked so hard to build. When they left the bar, the night was cool, with a faint scent of jasmine growing along the street. Thomas stopped by his car, looking up at the stars. "Thanks for listening," he said. "I really needed someone to talk to." "You're welcome," Jake replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "Call me if anything happens." Thomas nodded and got into the car, and Jake stood there, watching his friend drive away. He felt like a coward. He could have stopped this, he could have told the truth. But instead he chose silence, hoping that somehow everything would work itself out. He knew it was a false hope, but it was all he had left. It was a Saturday morning in suburban Los Angeles, and Emily Kelly was greeted by bright sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of her bedroom, casting golden streaks across the hardwood floor. She sat on the edge of her bed, clutching a small bag filled with only the bare essentials, a few changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a book she hadn't opened in weeks. Her fingers fiddled nervously with the zipper of the bag, and her gaze wandered around the room, taking in the familiar details she saw every day. The photo of their wedding on the dresser, Mike's drawing taped to the mirror, the pile of laundry she hadn't sorted. It was her life, her home, but now it felt foreign, like the set for a play in which she had forgotten her role. Emily felt her heart beat unevenly. Today she was supposed to leave for the weekend with Matthew. He had suggested they spend 2 days at a small hotel outside of town, an hour outside of Los Angeles, at the foot of the hills where the air smelled of pine and freedom. Just to relax, he had said in their last conversation, and his voice had been so soft, so persuasive, that she hadn't been able to refuse. But now, standing in front of the mirror and looking at her reflection, a woman with tired eyes and a slight blush, she felt a mixture of guilt and fear wash over her. She knew this was more than just a vacation. This was a move that could change everything. Thomas came downstairs, holding a mug of coffee. He was dressed in an old t-shirt and jeans, his hair still damp from the shower. "Are you sure you want to go to this seminar?" he asked, setting the mug on the kitchen table. "I can take the day off, take the kids somewhere. We could spend time together." Emily forced a smile, trying to keep her voice casual. "This is an important trip," she said, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder. "Editors from several magazines will be there. It's a chance for me to, move on." Thomas nodded, but his gaze was intense, almost searching. She felt her throat tighten. He'd been asking her questions more often these past few days: where she was going, who she was seeing, why she was so late responding to her texts. She knew he suspected something, and the knowledge weighed on her like a stone. Last night, she'd sat in the bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror, rehearsing the words she wanted to say. "Thomas, there's something I need to tell you." She'd imagined telling him about Matthew, how their casual conversations had grown into more, how alive she felt with him. But every time she opened her mouth, the words dissolved, leaving only fear. What if he didn't forgive her? What if he took the children? What if she destroyed everything they'd spent years building? "Call me when you get there," Thomas said, interrupting her thoughts. "And be careful." "Of course," she replied, trying not to meet his eyes. She kissed his cheek, feeling her lips tremble, and quickly left the house before she could lose her resolve. The city park where she had arranged to meet Matthew was a short drive from her house. It was her favorite place: green lawns surrounded by old oak trees, a playground where Sophie and Mike had once spent hours on the carousel, and a small lake where ducks swam lazily in the shade of the willows. Today, the park was bustling with families walking with children, teenagers riding skateboards, and an elderly couple sitting on a bench feeding pigeons. Emily parked the car and got out, feeling the fresh air filling her lungs. She glanced at her phone. Matthew had texted that he was already waiting for her at the lake. He stood by the water, dressed in jeans and a light gray shirt, a backpack slung over his shoulder. His camera was hanging around his neck, and he was taking pictures of the ducks that glided across the water, leaving soft ripples in their wake. When he saw her, he smiled, the same smile that made her heart beat faster. "You finally came," he said, coming closer. "I was afraid you'd change your mind." Emily felt her cheeks heat up. "I almost changed my mind," she admitted, looking out at the water. "It's harder than I thought." Matthew nodded, his gaze soft but attentive. "I know. And if you want to come back, I'll understand. No questions asked." His words were sincere, and that made her even more confused. She wanted to turn and leave, to go home, to the children, to Thomas, to her normal life. But something inside her, the part that was tired of being invisible, pulled her forward. "No," she said quietly. "I want to go." They climbed into his car, an old SUV with worn seats and the smell of leather upholstery. Matthew turned on the radio, and soft guitar chords filled the cabin. The road took them through the hills, where the landscape changed from suburban streets to open fields and sparse pine groves. Emily looked out the window, feeling the tension in her chest begin to dissolve. She didn't know what lay ahead, but in that moment, with the wind rushing through the cracked window and the music playing in the background, she felt free. The hotel they arrived at was small, almost family-run, with wooden balconies and views of the hills. Their room was on the second floor, with wide windows that opened up to a panorama of green slopes. Emily put her bag down by the bed and walked to the window, looking out at the view. Matthew stood next to her, not touching her, but she felt his presence warm, comforting, but also dangerous. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, pointing to the hills. "I found this place a couple of years ago when I was shooting sunsets for a project. It's like time stands still here." Emily nodded, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her sweater. "I need a place like this," she said quietly, "where I can just breathe." Matthew looked at her, his eyes full of understanding. "Then let's breathe," he said, taking her hand. His touch was light, but it made her heart beat faster. She didn't pull away. They spent the day walking the paths around the hotel, talking about books, about his travels, about her dreams she had long since buried. Matthew talked about the small towns where he had photographed people, their stories that were at once simple and profound. Emily listened, feeling her own life seem more distant. She told him about the stories she had written in college, how she had wanted to be a writer but had chosen stability. He listened attentively, without interrupting, and his questions about her characters, about her ideas, made her feel important. They returned to their room in the evening, and the tension that had been building all day finally broke. Matthew kissed her, and Emily, instead of pulling away, kissed him back. Their closeness was passionate, almost desperate, as if they were both trying to capture a moment they knew would not last. But even in those moments, Emily couldn't stop thinking about home. She saw Sophie's and Mike's faces and heard Thomas's voice asking where she was. Guilt washed over her in waves, but the passion she felt with Matthew was stronger. Later, lying in his arms, she stared at the ceiling, feeling her heart break. "What are we doing, Matthew?" she asked quietly. "This isn't right." He turned to her, his hand still on her waist. "I know," he said, "but this is real. You feel it, don't you? We could start over, Emily. You and me. No past, no strings attached." His words were as enticing as a song she couldn't stop listening to. She imagined a life with him, traveling, talking until the early hours, the freedom to be who she once dreamed of being. But then she thought of Sophie, the hurt look in her eyes after a concert, of Mike, who asked her to read him a book every night before bed, and of Thomas, who, despite everything, was her home. "I can't," she said, her voice shaking. "I have children. I have a life." Matthew nodded, his eyes sad but not judgmental. "I understand," he said, "but if you ever decide you're ready, I'll be here." Emily turned away, tears stinging her eyes. She wanted to stay, wanted to drown in this moment, but she knew she couldn't. She stood up and began gathering her things, her movements jerky, almost panicked. "I need to go home," she said. "I can't stay here." Matthew didn't argue. He drove her back to town, and they were silent the entire way. When he pulled up to the park where her car was parked, he looked at her. "If you change your mind, text me," he said. Emily nodded but didn't answer. She stepped out of the car, her legs shaking. She knew she was going home to Thomas and the kids, but she also knew that part of her was still there, in that hotel, with Matthew, and that part of her was haunting her. The afternoon light flooded the morning brew, reflecting off the polished wood tables and casting a soft glow on the glass cases filled with fresh croissants and homemade empanadas. Laura Mendez stood behind the counter, mechanically wiping a clean coffee cup, though her mind was elsewhere. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of students glued to their laptops in the corner and an older woman slowly leafing through a magazine by the window. Usually, Laura found solace in the familiar bustle of the place, the hiss of the coffee machine, the ring of the doorbell, the small conversations with customers. But today, her hands moved of their own accord, and a feeling like the weight of wet sand began to build in her chest. She knew she had to do something about the secret she'd been carrying for over a week, a secret that belonged to her friend Emily Kelly. Laura had seen Emily with that photographer, Matthew, in her cafe. Their closeness, her smile, his light touches, it was all too obvious. Laura tried to convince herself that it was none of her business, that she had no right to judge. She knew how hard it was to be a wife, a mother, a woman trying to hold it all together when her own life felt empty. Her own marriage to Raoul was falling apart. They barely spoke, and his late nights were becoming more frequent. But Emily? Laura couldn't understand how her friend, with her perfect family, with Thomas, who, despite his busy schedule, clearly loved her, could do such a thing. And yet Laura had seen her eyes, her laughter, her animation around Matthew. She knew Emily was looking for what she was missing at home, but that didn't excuse what she had done. Laura set her cup on the counter and glanced at her watch. Noon. Thomas would probably be home. It was Saturday, and he usually spent the morning with the kids while Emily was at her writing workshop. Laura knew it was a lie. She'd seen Emily leave yesterday morning, her bag too small for the workshop, her eyes too guilty. Laura tried to remain silent, tried not to interfere, but the secret was burning inside her. She couldn't watch Thomas continue to live in an illusion, unknowingly. He deserved the truth, even if it broke his heart. "Hey, Sarah," Laura called to her assistant, who was arranging pastries in the display case. "I'm going to be gone for an hour. Can you handle it?" Sarah, a young woman with bright red hair, nodded. "No problem, Laura. Go ahead, I'll handle this." Laura took off her apron, put on a light jacket, and walked out of the cafe. The street was warm, with a light breeze that carried the scent of orange blossoms. Kelly's house was a 10-minute walk away, and Laura decided that a walk would help her collect her thoughts. But every step only increased her anxiety. She imagined Thomas's face, his reaction, his pain. She knew that after this conversation, her friendship with Emily would most likely end. But she also knew that she could no longer remain silent. When she got to Kelly's house, she saw Thomas in the yard. He was fiddling with Mike's bike, trying to fix the chain. His hands were covered in oil, and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. Sophie was sitting on the porch, scrolling through her phone, and Mike was running around the lawn with a football. Laura stopped at the fence, feeling her resolve begin to melt. This was their life, ordinary, warm, full of little moments that she was about to ruin. "Laura." Thomas noticed her and straightened up, wiping his hands with a rag. "What are you doing here? Want some coffee? We have your favorite, with almond syrup." Laura forced a smile, but her lips trembled. "No, thank you," she said, opening the gate. I need to talk to you. It's important." Thomas frowned, his face becoming serious. "Is something wrong with Raoul? Or Carlos? He asked, coming closer. No, it's okay, she answered quickly, feeling her voice shake. It's about Emily. Thomas froze, his eyes narrowing. What about her? Is she okay? His voice was full of concern, but Laura sensed something else in it, a hint of suspicion that seemed to have been there for a long time. Can I come in? Laura asked, looking back at the children. It's better to talk inside. Thomas nodded, and they walked into the house. The living room was cozy, with a soft sofa piled high with pillows and a shelf filled with Emily's books and family photos. Laura sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clutching the hem of her jacket nervously. Thomas sat across from her, his face tense but silent, waiting for her to speak. I don't know how to start, Laura said, looking at the floor. I've been thinking for a long time about whether I should do this, but I can't keep quiet any longer. It's about Emily. She's dating someone. Thomas looked at her, and for a moment Laura thought he didn't understand. His face remained still, but his eyes widened. What do you mean? He asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Laura swallowed, feeling her throat tighten. I saw her at the cafe, with a man. His name is Matthew. They were too close, Thomas. It didn't look like a simple business meeting. I tried to talk to her, but she brushed me off. Then I found out she went away with him for the weekend. She told you it was a seminar, but it wasn't. Thomas sat still, his hands clenched into fists. Laura watched his face change from shock to disbelief to something she couldn't quite place. Are you sure? He asked, his voice hoarse. Could you be wrong? It could just be a meeting. Laura shook her head. I know Emily. I've seen the way she looks at him. It's not just friendship. Thomas, I'm so sorry. The silence in the room became heavy, almost tangible. Thomas stood up and paced the living room, his steps sharp, as if he was trying to shake what he had heard out of himself. Why are you telling me this? He asked suddenly, turning to her. His voice was full of pain, but there was anger in it too. Why now? Laura felt tears sting her eyes. Because you're my friend, she said, and I couldn't watch you live without knowing. I thought it would help, that you'd be able to move on. Move on? Thomas almost shouted, but then lowered his voice, remembering the children in the yard. You think I can just move on? This is my family, Laura, my wife. I know, she whispered, hanging her head. I didn't mean for it to happen. I couldn't keep it inside anymore. Thomas turned away, looking out the window. His shoulders were tense, his hands still clenched into fists. Laura could see him struggling with what she had just said. She wanted to stand up, to hug him, to say something that would ease the pain, but she knew there were no words. Thank you for telling me, he said finally, his voice cold, almost alien. I'll figure it out. Laura nodded, feeling her heart tighten. She stood up to leave, but stopped at the door. If you need to talk, I'm here, she said quietly. I'm sorry, Thomas. He didn't answer, and she went out, leaving him alone in the living room. Thomas stood at the window, watching Sophie and Mike run around the yard, their laughter coming through the glass. He felt his world crumbling, but at the same time, he was growing angry not just at Emily, but at himself for not noticing, for not stopping, for not being attentive enough. Late in the evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Thomas sat in his office, a small room on the second floor where he kept his work papers. His laptop was open, but it wasn't working. Instead, he was searching the internet for private investigators. He didn't want to believe Laura, didn't want to believe that Emily would do this, but he also couldn't ignore what she had said, the photos he had seen, the messages on her phone. He found the website of a local detective firm and, after some hesitation, sent in a request. I need to check who my wife is dating, he wrote, his fingers shaking on the keyboard. 2 days later, a middle-aged detective with a tired look and a folder in his hands came to his house. He showed Thomas photographs, Emily and Matthew in a cafe, in a park, by a car. In one picture, they were holding hands, and Thomas felt his throat tighten. The detective handed him a printout of calls and text messages, nothing explicit, but enough to confirm that their meetings were regular. "If you need more, I can continue," the detective said, but Thomas shook his head. "That's enough," he said, his voice empty. "Thank you." After the detective left, Thomas sat in the office, looking at the photographs. He didn't know what to do next. He wanted to scream, he wanted to call Emily, who was still in the seminar, and demand an explanation. But instead, he just sat there, feeling the trust he thought was the foundation of their marriage crumble to dust. La Bella Vita, a restaurant in downtown Los Angeles, was one of those places where the dim candlelight and soft clinking of glasses created the illusion of sophistication, but behind the facade there was a tense human drama that could be playing out at any table. On this Friday night, the room was packed. Businessmen in suits discussed deals, couples whispered over glasses of wine, and waiters in black vests gilded between tables with practiced grace. Thomas Kelly sat by the window at a table for three that he had reserved 2 days earlier. His fingers tapped nervously on the edge of the crisp white tablecloth, his gaze darting back to the front door. He wore a dark gray suit jacket that he wore only on special occasions and a shirt that had been carefully pressed that morning. But his face, usually calm and good-natured, was tense, and his eyes glittered with a suppressed emotion that he himself could not fully define, whether rage or pain. Thomas had planned this dinner 2 days ago, after the detective had given him photos and phone records that confirmed his worst suspicions. Emily had returned from a writing workshop on Sunday evening, smiling slightly and telling him about a productive weekend. She looked tired but happy, and that happiness cut through Thomas like a knife. He hadn't told her anything, hadn't shown her he knew. Instead, he'd decided to set up a meeting that would set the record straight. He'd texted Emily that morning, asking if they could meet for dinner to celebrate her work. She'd agreed, unsuspecting. Then, through a mutual friend from the book club, he'd gotten Matthew Crow's number and texted him, posing as Emily's colleague at the magazine, asking if they could discuss his photo project over dinner. Matthew, unsuspecting, had agreed. Now Thomas sat looking at the empty chairs across from him, trying to collect his thoughts. He didn't know what he wanted from this evening revelation, explanation, or maybe just the chance to look into the eyes of the person he now knew had become a part of his life without his knowledge. He felt two desires fighting inside him: to scream, to blame, to let out everything that had accumulated, and at the same time to understand why this had happened, what he had done wrong, to make Emily seek comfort from another. The door to the restaurant opened and Emily walked in. She was wearing a navy blue dress that showed off her figure, and her hair was down, slightly curled at the ends. She smiled when she saw Thomas, but her smile was cautious, as if she sensed that something was wrong. "You're early," she said, sitting down across from him. "This place, it's gorgeous. What's the occasion?" Thomas forced a smile, though his lips barely obeyed. "I just wanted to surprise you," he said, trying to keep his voice warm. "You work so hard, I thought we should get out somewhere together." Emily nodded, but her gaze slid around the room, as if she were searching for something or someone. "That's nice," she said, picking up the menu. "But you could have warned me. I would have worn something more appropriate." "You look great," Thomas said, and his words were sincere despite the storm inside him. He looked at her familiar features, at the slight crinkles around her eyes that he had always found charming, and felt his heart clench. How could she, he thought, but at the same time, he saw in her the same Emily he had loved all these years, and that made it all the more difficult. Before she could respond, the door opened again and Matthew walked in. He was wearing a dark shirt and jeans, with a light stubble on his face and a camera slung over his shoulder, as if he always had it. He spotted Emily and Thomas and walked toward their table, his steps confident but his eyes wide with surprise when he saw Emily. "Emily," he said, stepping closer, "you didn't say you'd be here too." Emily froze, her face pale. She looked at Thomas, then at Matthew, and her eyes widened in realization. "Thomas," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "What? What's going on?" Thomas smiled, but his smile was cold, almost alien. "I thought it might be interesting for us all to meet," he said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Matthew, right? Sit down. I'm Thomas, Emily's husband. We haven't met, have we?" Matthew froze for a second, his gaze flickering to Emily, but he quickly composed himself and sat up. "Yeah, nice to meet you," he said, his voice even, but Thomas noticed his fingers tightening slightly on the strap of his camera. "I thought this was about my photography project." "Oh, sure," Thomas nodded, his tone almost friendly, but there was a hint of steel in it. "Emily's been talking a lot about your photography. I thought I'd meet the man who inspires my wife so much." Emily clutched the napkin in her hands, her fingers shaking. "Thomas," she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "Let's order something," he said, opening the menu. "Matthew, what do you like? Wine? Or are you more of a beer person?" Matthew cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Wine will do," he said, glancing at Emily, who was looking down at the table, avoiding his eyes. The waiter came over, and Thomas ordered a bottle of red wine and some appetizers, his voice calm, almost carefree. But Emily knew him too well. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the menu just a little too tightly. She could feel the air in the restaurant growing thick, as if a storm were coming. She wanted to get up, to leave, to say something that would break the tension, but her throat was tight with fear. He knows, she thought, and the thought was like a blow. When the waiter left, Thomas leaned back in his chair, looking at Matthew. "Tell me about your project," he said. "Emily said you were filming the real America. What does that mean?" Matthew, still trying to figure out what was going on, began to speak. "It's about people," he said, his voice careful. "Their stories, their faces. I'm trying to capture moments that show who they really are. Not staged shots, but life." "Interesting," Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving Matthew. "And Emily helps you with this. She wrote about your pictures, right?" Emily felt her cheeks heat up. "Thomas," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "maybe we can talk about this later?" "Why later?" he asked, turning to face her. His tone was still calm, but there was a hint of threat in it. "We're all here. Let's talk now. Matthew, you don't mind, do you? Tell me about the photos you took of Emily. I've seen some. They're impressive." Matthew swallowed, his gaze flicking to Emily, but she was silent, her fingers clutching the napkin so tightly the fabric was beginning to tear. "They were just portraits," he said, "for her article. She wanted to add a visual component to her work." "Portraits," Thomas repeated, his voice level but mocking. "On the beach, in a cafe, outside a bookstore. Very personal portraits." Emily felt her heart stop. She looked at Thomas, and in his eyes she saw not only pain, but something else, a determination that frightened her. "Thomas, please," she said, her voice shaking. "Let's go. We'll talk at home." But Thomas shook his head. "No, Emily," he said, his voice quieter, almost soft. "I know everything. I know about you and Matthew, about your meetings, your seminars. I saw the photos, the messages. I hired a detective to make sure." Emily felt the world crumble around her. She wanted to say something, to explain, but the words stuck in her throat. Matthew looked at her, his face a mixture of shock and guilt. "Thomas," he began, "I didn't mean to." "Don't," Thomas snapped, his voice still calm, but with a hint of steel in it. "I don't want your excuses. I just wanted to look you both in the eye. I wanted to understand why." Emily felt tears sting her eyes. "Thomas," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." But Thomas wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on nothing, as if he were trying to keep himself from exploding. "I'm not going to scream," he said finally. "I'm not going to make a scene. I just want you both to know that I know. And now I have to decide what to do about it." Matthew stood up, his face pale. "I'm leaving," he said quietly. "It was a mistake. I'm sorry." He walked out of the restaurant, leaving Emily and Thomas alone. Emily looked at her husband, her hands shaking. "Thomas," she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "Not now," he said. "I don't want to talk. Not today." He stood up, threw a few bills on the table, and walked out, leaving her sitting at the table, surrounded by the hum of the restaurant, which now seemed unbearably loud to her. Night had fallen inside Kelly's house on Oak Street, and the silence that had settled over the Los Angeles suburb was almost tangible. The streetlights cast soft circles of light on the sidewalks, and the stars, barely visible through the city haze, seemed distant and indifferent. Inside, the house was dark, except for the dim glow of the living room lamp, where Emily and Thomas sat at opposite ends of the couch. The windows were open, and a gentle breeze stirred the curtains, bringing with it the faint scent of jasmine from the garden. The children were asleep upstairs, Sophie with her headphones forgotten on her pillow, and Mike curled under a blanket with a teddy bear. The house that had always been their sanctuary now felt fragile, as if the walls might crumble with one wrong word. Emily sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes red from the tears she had been holding back all evening. She still had the dress she had worn in the restaurant on, but it seemed out of place now, too dressy for this moment. Thomas sat with his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor, where the carpet bore the marks of their lives, stains from spilled juice, scuffs from children's play. After the scene in the restaurant where he had revealed his knowledge of her affair with Matthew, they had driven home in silence. The car seemed filled with their unspoken thoughts, and every mile they drove only increased the tension. Now, in the silence of the living room, they had to talk, but neither of them knew where to begin. Emily was the first to break the silence, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Thomas," she said, looking at her hands, "I don't know what to say. I'm so ashamed." Thomas didn't look up, his fingers curled, but he said nothing. She waited for him to scream, to blame her, to throw her out of the house, but his silence was worse. It was heavy, as if he were weighing her every word, her every mistake. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but even. "Why, Emily?" he asked. "I just want to understand. Why?" She felt her throat tighten and closed her eyes, trying to find the words. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she began, her voice shaking. "I wasn't looking for this. Matthew, he just showed up. We talked about books, about life, about things I hadn't discussed with anyone in a long time, and I felt alive. For the first time in a long time." Thomas looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and there was such pain in them that Emily wanted to turn away. "Alive," he repeated, his voice full of bitterness. "And you didn't feel alive with me, with the children, in this house we built together?" Emily shook her head, her tears finally breaking through. "It's not like that," she said, wiping her cheeks. "I love you, Thomas. I love Sophie and Mike. But I don't know how to explain it. I felt invisible. You were always at work, always busy. I tried to talk to you, tell you about my articles, about the things that were bothering me, but you just nodded, and I wanted to be heard." Thomas pressed his lips together, his face tense. He knew she was right, and the knowledge burned inside him. He remembered how he'd often come home late, how he'd missed Sophie's school concerts, how he'd forgotten to ask Emily how her day had been. He'd thought he was doing it for his family, for the mortgage, for the kids' future, for stability. But now he saw that stability had come at a high price. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice quieter. "I thought you were okay. You always seemed so strong." Emily smiled bitterly. "Strong," she repeated. "I'm not strong, Thomas. I'm tired. Tired of being the one holding it all together. Tired of writing articles that no one reads. Tired of just being a mom and a wife. I wanted to feel like myself again." Thomas looked at her, his heart torn between pain and sympathy. He wanted to hate her, wanted to blame her for everything, but her words had touched something inside him. He remembered her in college, bright, full of ideas, with a notebook filled with stories she'd read to him at night. He loved her for that, for her passion, for her intelligence. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped noticing her, stopped seeing the girl who dreamed of more than suburban life. "I failed you," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. I know. I was so caught up in work, in projects, in keeping everything under control. I thought that was what the family needed. But I didn't see you, Emily, and I'm so sorry. His words caught her off guard. She'd expected anger, accusations, but not this. She looked up at him, her eyes full of tears. That doesn't excuse what I did, she said. I knew it was wrong. I knew it would hurt you. But I couldn't stop. Matthew, he saw me. He listened. And I let it go too far. Thomas nodded, his hands clenched into fists, but he held back. What does he mean to you? He asked, his voice even but pained. Do you love him? Emily fell silent, her gaze falling to the carpet. She thought of Matthew, his easy smile, the way he made her feel alive. But she also thought of Thomas, the years they'd spent together, the children sleeping upstairs. No, she said finally, I don't love him. It was like an escape, like I could be someone other than Emily who was stuck in this life. But I don't want to be someone else. I want to be here, with you, with the kids, if you give me a chance. Thomas looked at her, his thoughts chaotic. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that they could fix this. But the images from the photographs the detective had shown him still lingered in his mind. Emily on the beach, her laugh, her hand in Matthew's. He felt his heart torn between his love for her and the pain of betrayal. I don't know if I can forget, he said honestly. I don't know how to live with this, Emily. But I don't want to lose our family. I want to try. Emily nodded, her tears flowing freely. I want that too, she whispered. I'll do anything to fix it. Anything. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. I talked to Jake a couple of days ago, he said, his voice quieter. He told me to be more attentive to you. I didn't listen. Maybe if I'd noticed, we wouldn't be here. Emily stood up and walked toward him, her hand touching his shoulder, but he didn't turn around. It's not just your fault, she said. I should have talked to you. I should have told you I felt bad. But I didn't. We both didn't. Thomas nodded, his gaze still focused on the darkness. We need to talk, he said. Not just today. Always. I don't want us to end up in a place like that again. Emily squeezed his shoulder, her fingers shaking. I agree, she said. Maybe we should see someone, a therapist, to figure this out together. Thomas turned to her, his eyes full of pain, but also genuine hope. Yes, he said, I think it's a good idea. But Emily, it's going to be hard. I don't know if I can trust you again. I know, she replied, her voice barely audible. But I'll try, every day. They stood there, silent, looking at each other, and in that silence was everything their pain, their love, their fear of the future. They knew the road ahead would be long and testing. The therapist, the conversations, the attempts to rebuild trust, all of that was just the beginning. But in that moment, in the darkness of their living room, they decided they were ready to try. Emily took his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. They sat back on the couch, still holding hands, and were silent. The silence wasn't heavy like before, but cautious, as if they were both afraid to upset a delicate balance. They didn't know what would happen next, but they knew they wanted to be together. And that, for now, was enough. The warm September light was washing over the Los Angeles suburbs, painting the streets in a golden hue that made everything seem a little softer, a little less real. The morning brew on Main Street was buzzing with its usual morning buzz. The clinking of coffee cups, the laughter of students, the smell of freshly baked muffins as Laura Mendez pulled them from the oven. She stood behind the counter, her hands moving with practiced dexterity, pouring lattes and bagging sandwiches, but her gaze was unfocused, wandering somewhere beyond the room. It had been a month since she had told Thomas the truth about Emily, and since then her life had seemed to have lost some of its light. Emily no longer came into the cafe, didn't call, didn't answer her texts. Their friendship, which had once been so warm, had now become an emptiness, and Laura felt that emptiness weighing on her every day. She tried to justify what she had done. She told herself that she had done the right thing, that Thomas deserved to know the truth, that lying would have destroyed their family even faster. But every time she saw the empty table in the corner where Emily liked to sit with her laptop, her heart sank. She remembered their conversations about children, about dreams, about the hardships of being a woman in a world that expected you to be perfect. Laura knew Emily was lonely, knew that her marriage to Thomas had become routine, but she also knew that her own meddling had probably destroyed more than it had saved. "Laura, are you okay?" Sarah, her assistant, broke her out of her thoughts. The girl was standing by the coffee machine, holding an empty milk jug. "You've been wiping the same cup for 5 minutes now." Laura forced a smile, but her lips trembled. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, setting her cup down on the shelf. "Just thinking, can you take the orders from that table? I'll be right back." She walked out to the back of the cafe where the boxes of supplies were stored and leaned against the wall, feeling the cool brick calm her. She pulled out her phone and opened the chat with Emily. The last message she had sent 2 weeks ago was still unanswered. "Emily, I know you're angry, but I want to talk. Please." She started to type a new message, but her fingers froze. What could she say? "I'm sorry I ruined your life. I thought I was doing the right thing." She deleted the words she had started and put the phone away, feeling her throat tighten with tears. Meanwhile, a few miles away, Jake Wilson sat in his downtown office. His desk was piled high with divorce, child support, and custody cases, and a half-written pitch for yet another client glowed on his computer screen. Jake was dressed impeccably, as always, in a dark suit and a white shirt slightly unbuttoned at the neck, but his eyes betrayed the weariness that had been building for years. His job had trained him to see the worst in people: betrayals, lies, greed, and he had long since grown accustomed to it. But Thomas and Emily kept haunting him. He had known about Matthew before Laura had told him the truth, and his silence now felt like a betrayal. Jake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He remembered seeing Thomas the day before at his son's soccer game. They'd stood on the sidelines, watching Mike run after the ball, his small feet flashing in his two big sneakers. Thomas looked exhausted, his smile strained, his conversation short. Jake tried to make conversation, to ask about his job, about the kids, but Thomas's answers were monosyllabic, his gaze distant, as if searching for answers in the clouds above the field. "You okay, man?" Jake asked then, clapping him on the shoulder. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." Thomas smiled weakly, his eyes dull. "Yeah, it's okay," he said, but his voice was empty. "It's just a lot of things." Jake nodded, his conscience clenching. He wanted to say, "I knew. I saw her with him. I'm sorry I didn't tell you." But instead he changed the subject, talking about the score of the game, the weather, anything to avoid the truth. He saw Thomas trying to hold on, the way he smiled at Mike when he scored, but he also saw the shadows under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. Jake knew that his silence had made him complicit, and the thought haunted him. "Mr. Wilson, your client is on the line." The secretary's voice brought him out of his thoughts. Jake nodded, but instead of picking up the phone, he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. He thought about his own marriage, about the pain he'd gone through when he'd found out about Carol's infidelity. He'd wished someone had told him the truth sooner, so he wouldn't feel like a complete fool. But now, looking at Thomas's situation, he wasn't sure the truth was always better than a lie. He decided he'd talk to Thomas, but not today. Maybe tomorrow. Or next week. He just didn't know how to start. Meanwhile, the silence in the Kellys' house on Oak Street was not the comfortable silence that comes with evening, but a heavy, unspoken silence. Emily and Thomas sat at the kitchen table, cups of cold, unzipped tea in front of them. They had just returned from their first session with a couples therapist, a woman named Dr. Ramirez, whose office smelled of lavender and books. It had been a difficult session. They had talked about their expectations, their pain, what had led them to this moment. Emily had talked about her loneliness, how she had felt invisible. Thomas had talked about his work, how he thought he was doing everything for his family, but hadn't noticed how he was drifting away from them. Dr. Ramirez had listened, asking questions but not providing answers, and it had left them both feeling unsettled. Emily looked at her hands, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her napkin. "I don't know how to fix this," she said quietly. "I want things to go back to the way they were, but I don't know if that's possible." Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the window, where the dark garden faded into night. "I don't know either," he said, "but I'm trying. I really am, Emily." She looked at him, her eyes full of tears. "I know," she whispered, "and I thank you for that. But sometimes I think you're still angry, and I don't blame you. I'm afraid you'll never be able to trust me." Thomas pressed his lips together, his hands resting on the table, motionless, as if he was afraid any movement would betray his emotions. "I'm angry," he admitted. "Not at you, not just at you. At myself. Not seeing that you were hurt. Let this happen. But I don't want this anger to destroy us." Emily nodded, her fingers tightening on the napkin. "I don't want that either," she said. "But I don't know how to live with this guilt. Every time I see Sophie or Mike, I think about how I could have ruined their lives." Thomas looked at her, a mixture of pain and determination in his eyes. "We won't ruin their lives," he said. "We'll do everything we can to make them happy, even if it's hard." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Sophie, wearing unicorn pajamas, came down to the kitchen, her face sleepy but alert. "Why are you shouting?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with concern. Emily and Thomas exchanged glances, their hearts clenching. They weren't screaming, but their voices, full of emotion, must have woken her. "We're not screaming, honey," Emily said, forcing a smile. "Just talking. Go to sleep." But Sophie didn't move. She looked at her parents, her eyes too mature for her 12 years. "Are you fighting about Daddy's job?" she asked. "Or something else?" Thomas felt his throat tighten. He stood and walked over to his daughter, dropping to one knee to be level with her. "We're just talking about how to make our family better," he said, his voice soft. "Sometimes adults argue, but that doesn't mean we don't love each other. Or you and Mike." Sophie looked at him, her eyes shining. "You're not getting divorced, are you?" she asked quietly. "My friend Katie said her parents got divorced because they stopped talking. You're going to talk, right?" Emily felt her heart break. She stood up and wrapped her arms around Sophie, pulling her close. "We'll talk," she said, her voice shaking. "We promise." Sophie nodded, but her eyes were full of doubt. She turned and walked upstairs, her steps almost silent. Emily and Thomas remained in the kitchen, their eyes meeting, and in that moment they realized that their choice was no longer just about themselves. They had to fight not only for their marriage, but for their children, for their sense of security. The next day, Laura was standing behind the counter at the cafe when the door opened and Emily walked in. She was wearing jeans and a light sweater, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. Laura froze, her heart pounding. "Emily," she said, her voice full of hope. You came." Emily nodded, but her smile was reserved. "I wanted to talk," she said, approaching the counter. "But not here. Maybe we could take a walk." They walked outside, and Laura felt the tension building inside her. They walked in silence until they reached the park, where the benches by the lake were empty. Emily sat down, looking out at the water, her hands in her lap. "I'm not mad at you," she said finally. "I know why you told Thomas. But I need time, Laura. You were my friend, but I don't know how to be around you right now." Laura nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I understand," she said. "I just wanted to help. But I probably made it worse." Emily looked at her, her gaze soft but distant. "Maybe eventually we can start over," she said, "but not now." Laura nodded, feeling her heart clench. They sat in silence, watching the ducks swim across the lake, each knowing that their friendship would never be the same. Meanwhile, Jake met Thomas at another football match. They stood by the field, their conversation was brief, but Jake felt his conscience weighing on him more and more. "How are you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. Thomas shrugged, his eyes fixed on Mike, who was running after the ball. "We're seeing a psychologist," he said. "It's hard, but we're trying." Jake nodded, feeling his throat tighten. "That's good," he said. "If you need anything, I'm here." Thomas looked at him, and there was gratitude in his eyes, but also something else, a shadow of pain that might never go away. "Thank you," he said. "We just need time." Jake nodded, but his thoughts were filled with guilt. He knew that his silence had played a part in this story, and now he had to live with it. The evenings were quiet in the Kelly household. Emily and Thomas continued to see Dr. Ramirez, their conversations becoming a little easier, but there was still something unsaid in the air. They tried to be honest, tried to listen to each other, but each knew that trust was a fragile thing, and it would take years to rebuild. Sophie and Mike felt the tension, but their laughter, their games, their small victories at school concerts and football games were what held their parents together. They were sitting at dinner when Sophie suddenly asked, "Do you still love each other?" Her voice was quiet, but there was hope in it. Emily and Thomas looked at each other, their hands hovering over their plates. "Yes," Thomas said, his voice firm. "We love each other, and you and Mike." Emily nodded, her eyes shining. "We'll always be family," she said, "no matter what." Sophie smiled, and in that moment, their home felt like home again. But in the silence that followed dinner, Emily and Thomas knew their journey had only just begun. Could they rebuild trust? Could they become who they were again? These were unanswered questions, but they were willing to find them together. That's it, guys. This is the end of our story. What drama, right? Love, betrayal, family squabbles. We hope you were as hooked as we were. What do you think? Will Emily and Thomas be able to fix everything, or is their marriage doomed? Write in the comments. We can't wait to hear your opinion. If this story makes your heart beat faster, put a link, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell so you don't miss new episodes. Thanks for being with us. You are the best. See you in the next video. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.